Good morning. My name is William Spriggs. I'm a professor of economics at Howard University. I want to welcome you to this session where you will learn a lot about the contribution that historically Black colleges and universities played both to the production of STEM graduates needed for our nation's continued economic success, but also for economic mobility, which is important for our democracy. I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order of their presentation. You're going to hear from Professor Nicholas Hill, Dean of the School of Business at Claflin University, then from Omari Swinton, the Chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University, and then from James Koch, who is the President Emeritus and a professor of economics at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Nick will lead off with the importance of Blacks in STEM. Omari will give an analysis showing the marginal benefit, the higher likelihood that students have of both graduating in STEM of attending HBCUs. And James is going to discuss the importance of HBCUs to economic mobility. Dean Hill.
Thank you, Dr. Spriggs, for introducing me. I want to thank the National HBCU Conference as well. I think that the research that we're engaging in is something of importance. And so our research begins with understanding the students or the pool of students that colleges have to select from. So I began with the presentation that looks at comparing Black student SAT test takers and their role in how they apply to college. And also within this presentation in context, we'll examine how they compare to the general population. The factors that we consider for our measurement and the influence in majoring in STEM or their scores on the SAT include both individual, family, and STEM level and school level factors, which are what we denote as internal, environmental, and external. Our data set is unique because we are able to look at college-bound seniors from 2004 to 2007. And then we're also able to look at their student questionnaire that provides an opportunity for us to look at some of their activities and school activities and things of that nature. To give you a brief overview of the variables that we use for the individual level, we look at their scores and their ability on the SAT, as well as their GPA and some other demographic type information. We also look at their educational components, which includes the number of years of educational training in the measurable areas within the context of the test. Also, we look at their goals to obtain higher level degrees and whether or not they go into in their college preference in that. Also, we look at variables in their case of whether or not how certain are they about their major. At the family level, one of the things that we consider is the family income. We consider the financial aid that the student intends to get, and really the parent education. So we're looking at all the level factors that the family has. And at the school level, we look at the level of support and activities that each of the schools that they're coming from have, which includes sports and some of the arts. And when we really engage in the research, we wanted to look at how does our sample compare to the general population. So what we did was we looked at a logistic regression model, and we're going to be reporting the odds ratios associated with it. And we compared it to those of the ACT test takers. With regards to those who are majoring in STEM, we see that there's some similarities with the general population, and there's some contextual differences in there as well. We also see that GPA is a higher predictor of majoring in STEM with regards to our sample than in the general population. We also see that consistent across the board, the number of years of math is important in that as well. But one of the things that is a little bit a difference is whether or not the to go to a 2 year or 4 year college preference. It has is not that as significant with them result in majoring in STEM for this. So we can see from our first comparison is that our sample of students are similar, or just Black students in general, are similar to the general population. With regards to the influential factors associated with the scores on the SAT, one of the things that we kind of see is that the major influence in that is the number of years of math and science. We also see the importance of family income, and at the school level, having different activities that help increase the likelihood that they score higher on these particular exams. So in conclusion with what we're researching here, one of the takeaways is that our students, Black students in general, are similar and to the majority of students who take the SAT, but there are some factors associated with at the school level that influence, the scores and the ability to major in STEM-related discipline. At this time, Bill, I'm going to kick it back to you. Definitely open for questions afterwards.
Thank you, Dean Hill, for letting people know the characteristics of the students that we're going to have in this next analysis that Dr. Swinton is going to present, which shows predicting graduation and graduating in STEM conditional on applying and attending an HBCU.
So thank you for that introduction. I would like to say before I get started that this research is funded by an EIR grant from the National Science Foundation, which allowed us to be able to obtain the data that we're going to use in this analysis. Next slide. So this analysis is going to be preliminary results that look at HBCU and graduation rates. In particular, we're going to use probe results and regressions, and the results we're going to report are going to be marginal effect. And in instance, the marginal effect is going to tell us what happens when we look at the mean Black student in our sample. This data is going to be unique because it's going to be a combination of the College Board and National Student Clearinghouse data. So Nick went through the College Board data, so I won't talk as much about that. So again, we only have a sample of African American students who took the SAT from 2004 to 2007. A part of this research that's funded by the NSF, we're supposed to look at how HBCUs do at producing STEM graduates, how they do at graduating Black students, and whether or not, and how well they do at these students continuing on to graduate school. And so the National Student Clearinghouse data allows us to see what year the student graduated from high school, what was their initial college they enrolled in, the name of their degree award, which is how we determine whether or not they graduate with a STEM degree, whether or not they enrolled in graduate school, and their end state. And so the reason we have to have the sample from 2004 to 2007 is this gives us enough years to see whether or not the student graduated and whether or not they enrolled in college and graduate school. So we merge this with IPED's data, which gives us the school level characteristics, such as the FTE student basis, student expenditures, instructional expenditures, and academic support expenditures. We cannot identify the individual schools, but we are able to see whether the school is a HBCU or not. So our sample, our initial sample, which is the pool of students, covers 592,619 Black students who took the SAT in that time frame. Of this group, 39% applied to an HBCU. About a third of them actually attended the schools that they sent their scores to. However, another third attend the school that they didn't send their scores to. And about 75% of the students go to an in-state school, which when we get to Dr. Cook's analysis, you'll see why this is important. And so this is just the basic descriptive statistics for the sample. And so about 15% of our students attended a HBCU. And a lot of the students, as we said, a third of the sample who sent their scores to schools actually ended up not going to a school that they sent their scores to. And so we separate the samples by that. But what we see is that there's not really a significant difference between students who send their scores to an HBCU and who want to do STEM majors and those who do not. So this is the one of the main results from this research. And so what's important in the variable that we're going to be discussing is called attend an HBCU. And so if you look at the top of the column, that gives the probability of a Black student graduating if they didn't send their scores to HBCU, if they sent their scores to HBCU, if they wanted to be a STEM major and not. But what we see across the board is if we calculate the marginal effect of attending the HBCU, we see that the graduation rates increase, right? So if you take the mean student and they didn't go to a HBCU and all their characteristics are the same, but if you switch them to attending the HBCU, they would have been anywhere from 13% more likely to graduate with a bachelor's degree to 15%. And so we wanted to look at the SAT because SAT is oftentimes used as a predictor of success in college. And even across the different bands of the the SAT, students who attend HBCU are more likely to graduate. The only range in which we don't have a predicted positive effect of attending HBCU are Black students who score 1,400 or higher on the SAT. But if we look at other ranges, we see that the particular graduation rate is significantly higher at a HBCU. This is important to note because the average SAT score for Black students is around an 800. And in that group, that's where the majority of our sample shows up. And we see that a black student at the mean, if they would have switched from a PWI to an HBCU, they would have been 13% more likely to graduate with a bachelor's degree. If we look at the GPAs of the individual students, we see again across the board that students, if they would have attended HBCU, they would have been more likely to graduate with a bachelor's degree. So this next set of results shows the effects of all the students who graduate. So one of the questions that we're attempting to answer is, do HBCUs do a better job of getting the students who graduate to actually graduate in the STEM field? And what we see is if the students would have attended HBCU and they graduated, we see a positive effect on the likelihood that they would have graduated with a STEM degree across the board, whether they sent their scores to HBCU, whether they didn't consider HBCUs, whether they wanted to be a STEM major in high school, and even if they didn't want to be a STEM major. And again, this is an important fact because this means that HBCUs are able to convert students who don't want to be STEM majors into STEM majors and help those students who want to be STEM majors be more likely to graduate with a STEM degree. And so again, when we look at the results across the SAT, we see again in the range where SAT scores are greater than 1,400 that there's no marginal benefit for attending HBCU. But across the other bands, we do see that if the Black student who attended PWI would have went to an HBCU, they would have been more likely to have graduated with a STEM degree. And so the same result holds when we look across GPAs as well. So in general, Black students would have been more likely to graduate if they attended HBCU. And given that if they graduated from an HBCU, they would have been more likely to have graduated into a STEM field. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Spriggs to introduce Dr. Cook.
Thank you. And now Dr. Cook from Old Dominion will give us a presentation on intergenerational mobility, the difference between the earnings of the students and the earnings of the parents.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spriggs. And people involved in this interesting conference might well say, how did an old white guy like me, a former sort of has-been college president, get interested in questions of economic mobility relating to HBCUs? Well, it turns out in the last couple of years, I've published 2 books that relate to the whole issue of college access and affordability. Let's go on to the next slide. As I was doing this, I encountered a pretty interesting example that involved Princeton and Philander Smith. And I'm looking at these data where you can see the Princeton typical student family income ranks them at the 85th percentile nationally, where they're at Philander Smith, it's only the 32nd percentile. And I'm thinking, looking at this, gee, this is like in baseball, somebody starting out on second base or third base. It's a completely unequal comparison. And so I said, what we really need to do is to look at the data and see the value added of an institution, how well they are bringing people up from where they started. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, Opportunity Insights is based at Harvard, and they really focus on economic mobility questions and a lot of other topics that relate to economic opportunity today. Now, one of the data sets they have looks at college students who were born between 1980 and 1982. And then it says, well, in 2014, what income were they earning? And how did that compare to their parents' incomes? Really, what they're trying to get at then is the question of, are you doing better than your parents after you've gone to college? Next slide. Now, I have two different data sets I want to show you. The first one you'll see the start of right now, and it looks at specific institutions because oftentimes you get a better feel for what's going on if you can see a specific institution. That 1.30 for Alabama A&M says that the typical Alabama A&M student in 2014 was earning 30% more than his parents were earning. And at Miles, it's 33%, and at Alcorn, 46%, and so forth. See what's going on there. Now compare these numbers to the numbers for the PWIs in the same states. And you can see the PWIs always have lower numbers, and that means, relatively speaking, they're not doing as much for their students as the HBCUs are. Another way of saying this is HBCUs are providing their students with much more upward economic mobility than the PWIs. Next slide. This is a different selection of institutions, but again, looking at HBCUs compared to PWIs, and Florida A&M is doing a better job at that task than Florida State or the University of Central Florida. Now, I'm not saying that the students who graduate from Florida A&M necessarily earn as high a salary as those at Florida State. Rather, I'm saying they are brought up a much further distance and improved, comparatively speaking, much more. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, this shows you the data from a different angle where we're looking at all the institutions in a specific category. And I'd like you to look at HBCUs first, and let's look at column 2. The average household income of a student attending an HBCU in the United States is the 43rd percentile. Compare that at the private selective institutions to 77%. So you can see there are really differences in terms of the kinds of students. Now, this is no news to anybody who knows these situations. But if you go on to column 3, then you see, well, how many students at those institutions come from the lowest income quintile, the lowest 20% of incomes? And you can see at HBCUs, 23.4%, but you go down to the private selectives, it's only 3.9%. So they're really not letting in and financing and able to attend many upper or lower income students. Okay, now let's go on to column 4, which says, well, if you started in the lowest 20%, what's the chance, what's the probability that you're going to end up in the highest 20% in 2014? And you can see the private selectives do very well there, it's 45%. But then you go to that column to the left and you say, gee, they only let in about 1 out of every 25 students from the lowest income quintile. So in column 4, or 5 rather, sorry, in column 5, we take both columns 3 and 4 into account, and we weight the success of bringing up students by the number of students they're actually letting in. And so we're really saying, what's the total impact of an institution in terms of bringing up the most students the most effectively? And that number in column 5, 2.87, is essentially column 3 times column 4. And it says, gee, this is the total economic impact of a specific kind of school. And you can see that HBCUs easily have the highest mobility coefficient there. So the only PWIs that come close to competing with HBCUs in this regard are the institutions I call metro leaders. They're the large urban institutions that typically enroll large numbers of Black and minority students. But you'll see that the private institutions in particular really don't do a very good job. And the major reason they don't do a very good job at this is they simply don't admit lower income students to begin with. Let's go on to the next slide. That concludes my presentation, which is, again, all about how successful are institutions in bringing their students up from where they started, which, again, let's go back to my second base and third base comparison. It really, I think, isn't very useful to talk about students succeeding economically if they already started out in the upper 20%. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our presenters. I want to remind you of using the chat function if you would like to raise a question. I think for those of us in the HBCU community, this was a very important presentation. We have long complained that the scorecard that the Department of Education shares with students is wholly inadequate and tells them nothing meaningful about what HBCUs have to offer them. So a student who looks at that scorecard would think South Carolina State University is a horrible place. But as you see from the data we presented, you're more likely to graduate. You're more likely to graduate in a STEM area if you're trying to be in one of the more demanding fields in terms of what employers are looking for. And as you heard from Dr. Koch, you are more likely to be ahead of your parents' earnings and have a greater chance that you're going to move up to the top 20% of income if you came from the bottom 20%. Not having this context of what do the students look like, not having this context of what are the colleges actually achieving, that scorecard is so misleading. Thankfully, in a lot of research, we find that students ignore the scorecard. And a lot of economic research on education and school choices, we find that students ignore that scorecard, thank goodness, because it would be the wrong scorecard. But that scorecard and metrics similar to that scorecard are used to punish HBCUs and deny them funding in state after state after state. One of the important elements of the data that Dr. Koch used, as well as the data that you heard from Dr. Smith and Dr. Hill, we're looking at the long-term horizon of the student, not the short-term horizon in that scorecard. And that is an important element that is missing. We also in the scorecard don't see the share of low-income students who are being given access. All of this to say, this is important information, important for the nation in making decisions. Where do we invest? Do we have dead weight loss? Dr. Koch was pointing out a lot of students are already on third base before we come to bat. Knocking them in from third base is not that hard. And so a scorecard that doesn't tell me, yeah, all the students were on third base, doesn't tell me anything. And we need this information to be put into decisions about where our nation invests, particularly when we think about where are we making the investment and producing STEM graduates. Not understanding the importance of the HBCUs to that pipeline is very misleading. We have two questions in the chat from Kendall Cox. It seems to be a comment that's very provocative, and thank you for the presentation. Alicia Clark thanks us for the presentation. The question about whether we will share data from the study, yes, publications are on their way. I'll let Dr. Swinton talk about some of the dissemination that's underway.
So, like with everybody with COVID, our research project got pushed back a little bit. It took us a little longer to get to data. The data is the property of the College Board, so we actually cannot share the data. It's very difficult to get the data because we actually could see individual students where they go to college and where they graduate, and so we're not going to be able to share the data, but we will be able to publish the research. We have one working paper, and we're working on finishing these other papers. The NSF was gracious enough to give us a no-cost extension to give us another year to finish this research. And so this is an ongoing research project, and we're going to do different methods to hopefully be able to tease out a lot of the factors that the HBCUs have that can contribute to them being successful at um, producing Black students with STEM degrees, as well as what factors help them graduate Black students at a better rate than PWI.
Dr. Spriggs, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And just to add, Dr. Spriggs, myself, and Greg Price have a paper that look at the financial benefits of attending HBCUs. And in that paper, we examine one of the reasons why HBCUs might be more successful. And it has a lot to do with the identity of the students who attend and being in an environment where their identity is something that they're allowed to explore, right? And if you're a Black student at a PWI and you're the only one in your classes in a STEM major, it might not be as conducive to you graduating as being at an HBCU where the people actually believe you can do those fields. Speaking on economics, economics is one of those fields in which you don't have many Black people in economics in general, and the HBCUs are actually the top producers of undergraduate students who go on to get PhDs in economics. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that in this field, a lot of other economists don't believe the Black students are capable of doing the work. And so even if the student wanted to do the work, they wouldn't be encouraged to be in that field. And so we think one of the things that's going on at HBCUs, which if you look at the IPEDS data at graduation rates, HBCUs are constantly in the top 10 feeders for students who go on to get advanced degrees in STEM fields because they have these pipelines and the beliefs in their students.
Dr. Spriggs,
Dr. Cook, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I want to follow up on your comment about rating systems. I think I am correct that U.S. News and World Report, who has easily the most used and recognized rating system, gives only a 5% weight to economic mobility. So when they come up with their rankings, they're basically paying no attention to the ability of an institution to move people upward in society. If you can remember one of my slides where I'm showing a different kind of ranking, there's a huge difference between that and the rankings that U.S. News and World Report puts out. And that's something that public policymakers ought to pay more attention to.
Yes, and hopefully decision makers will share with students this broader set of information, because the scorecard is not very helpful. And I think this is a strong case for why it is not. The mobility issue is so important, and the access question is so important. If you look at the scorecard, you have no idea whether I would be accepted or not. And you don't have information conditioned on how well I performed in high school. This study controls for those factors and gives a greater insight to the student. We will be sharing the slide, or we can share the slides, and hopefully the Department of Education has this presentation and will make it available afterwards when access to the recording of the session is up. I'm trying to look at some of the other questions that are up there.
Yeah, I do see one that talks about how many students graduating with economics degrees are provided with jobs in their background. I'm not sure if I have that data provided for me with regard to that to give an accurate. I can only talk about it anecdotally. So does anybody else on the panel have anything to contribute to that question?
I'll answer the question in a roundabout way. So I'm the director of the AEA summer program, which goal is to increase the minority participation of minorities in the economics profession. And this is the first time this program has ever been at Howard University, at a HBCU. And so Howard, this past summer, hosted this set of students. And one of the issues that come up with this lack of representation in fields is that economists and are often the policymakers who make policy, and economists work in all different locations. Well, if you don't have a diverse group of economists making decisions, oftentimes the policies that come out aren't going to take into consideration the types of things that they should. And so, at Howard is the number one producer of Black students who go on to get PhDs in economics, and we're the number one producer of Black PhDs in economics, right? And so, but Howard is unique in that we have graduate programs that can do these types of things, and this is what our mission is. And one of the things I think that people miss is that universities oftentimes have these accidents where a Black student will come and they'll get a degree, not because the university reached out to them and helped mold them. It's just by happenstance. At Howard, that is our goal and that is our mission, right? Our mission is to graduate these students and empower them to do better in the future. And I know Dr. Hill could say the same thing about Claflin. And so one of the things that HBCU have is they have this mission of educating Black students. And because that's their mission and their goal and the reason of their founding, you often see students come out of HBCUs with this sense of pride and this love for their university that you don't see other people have. And the general answer is we do an excellent job of placing our students because a lot of companies want to find Black students to work in these fields. And because HBCUs has a mass of Black students, there's a lot of recruiting done. And, they get opportunities that they wouldn't get because they come to Howard or because they come to Claflin, because universities are professions that are interested in recruiting Black students come to these schools to recruit Black students. Like North Carolina A&T and Florida A&M have pipelines in which businesses just go to their business schools or their engineering schools because they want to diversify their population, because those schools do an excellent job at producing Black students who get degrees in engineering.
And Omari, to that point, let me just chime in. I think that with our research, and hopefully everybody can see, is that the number of HBCUs are doing well at training this diverse talent, and typically, a lot of these companies always go to the top schools that we kind of know about, but there's other schools, as shown on some of these slides, that are really good at producing scholars. And I think it's something to talk about, is that let's seek out those HBCUs that are doing good at what we're doing, to put them in students in the opportunities with these corporations and stuff like that. So that's exactly right on, Omari, about that.
In our study, we cannot release information about individual universities because in our data set, we have that blanked out, so we don't know individual universities. Dr. Koch can speak to the question of mobility because the Opportunity Insights data does identify individual colleges. The data set from Opportunity are from the tax records. And so these are administrative records. They are not self-reported. These are the incomes of the parents compared to the subsequent income of the students. And so this is beyond just what you might see in FAFSA, because this is the total income of the parents, capital income, all income that would be reported on the income tax form. But Dr. Koch, did you want to speak about how, if there are some colleges that stood out in your data set for increasing mobility?
Well, among HBCUs, the table that I presented, I think, shows the ones that are probably doing best. I think, Dr. Spriggs, what I'd like to do is emphasize a topic that we talked about the other day, and that is the prices that are being charged influence where people can go. Let me provide a specific example. South Carolina State University's net price after grants and loans is about twice as high as that at the University of South Carolina in Columbia for students who are coming from families earning $0 to $30,000 a year. Now, that's relevant to HBCUs because, as we just saw, 27 or 28% of all HBCU students were coming from that lowest income group. And so what that means is that the University of South Carolina and Columbia can attract those students because it can charge a lower price. And this reflects state appropriations, it reflects foundation values, it reflects other sources of funds that they can utilize to essentially attract and act as a magnet to attract Black students. Now, the reason that's relevant to what we're talking about here is they don't have as great a chance of graduating in a STEM discipline or anything else at the University of South Carolina as they do at a typical HBCU. So we have this sort of ironic circumstance where PWIs that have better resources are attracting Black students today. And I'll have to say my own institution, Old Dominion University, is probably one that's doing that. It's a PWI that now has 32% Black students and is able to underprice HBCUs and attract them. But those Black students don't necessarily have as high a chance of graduating or graduating in a STEM discipline as they would at the HBCU, which is something that I think most people don't know about.
Yes, and it's a very important point. It's part of the racial wealth gap that people don't discuss, which is the effect of the racial wealth gap measured in institutions. And we know that very few HBCUs have anything you would call a real endowment. And often it's that endowment income that's used to make up for tuition revenue for lower income students. If you look at what we presented, you see there's a clear economic model. You have a public policy choice. Either you put the burden on the students if you want to have a lot of low-income students, or you educate very few low-income students because the model to sustain your university is that you get tuition revenue from the other students. That's the deep question here. The dead weight loss, are we in our public policy putting the money in a way that can allow the greatest number of low-income students to have access and to graduate? And I think it's clear from this, the answer is no. And many state formulas don't take that into account. So as Dr. Koch was just mentioning, shouldn't the state of South Carolina be subsidizing South Carolina State to a greater degree, given it has taken on the mission of educating so many low-income students?
There's a few questions, Dr. Spriggs, in the chat. One is the social mobility baseline determined by parents' salaries only, as reported on the FAFSA?
Oh yeah, I addressed that one. It's their income
right.
tax. So this is a different database. There is a question directly to you though, because you presented on the similarity of students who take the ACT to students who take the SAT. And so if you could answer that question about, is this analysis that we've done relevant given that we have SAT takers instead of ACT takers?
Yeah. So to that point, what we're researching is the comparisons of the if there was any difference amongst Black test takers to the general population, and we also reference that across the ACT student. I do understand that a lot of persons or schools do give out the ACT, but in our data set, we had access to SAT test takers and some of the potential questionnaires. So we were able to compare similar questions and similar variables across that space to see if there was any difference between the two. And one of the things that, to reiterate what is found is that there isn't a lot of difference amongst Black SAT test takers in the form of their contextual factors, which include both individual, family, and school level. those who had higher GPAs wanted to, or more likely to major in the STEM related discipline. The SAT scores is linked to the family as well as the school level support that is there. And that was similar to that of the ACT. So at this time, we just compared our research with the ACT data set that was provided. But we look forward to, suggestions in any ways to increase that comparability of our sample.
There is a question on two-year schools. I'm not sure whether we delineated two-year schools in the data set. Can you answer that?
So we do have the ability to look at two-year schools, but we have not done that yet because one of the things we're supposed to answer for the NSF is how well do HBCUs do at producing students graduating, and they're really looking at four-year degrees. But we do have information on students of where, as long as that two-year college exists in the National Student Clearinghouse data, we see that the student enrolls in the two-year, and we'll see what degree they come out. And so we have the ability to look at associate's degrees, which are relevant for a lot of STEM fields, such as nursing or other technical or machining type fields, which don't require a bachelor. But there's not many HBCUs that are two-year schools, and so I'm not sure how much information will be in our sample because the students do have to take the SAT as well. And most two-year schools don't require students to take the SAT for attendance. And so I'm not sure of the coverage we have, but if they took the SAT during those years and they went to a two-year school and they got a associate degree and they reported to the student clearinghouse, we would be able to look at that information as well. But we just haven't had a chance to do that just yet.
There's a question about white students at HBCUs. Our data set was drawn from Black students who took the SAT. We don't have any white students in our data set. And in the Opportunity Insights, the students, I don't think are identified by race, Dr. Cook.
Yeah, I can address that a bit. Dr. Swinton and I are doing a book on HBCUs. It's pretty well along. And one of the things that we show in the book is that while HBCUs are becoming more diverse, it's not because they're getting more white students. It is because they're enrolling more Hispanic students for the most part, and to some extent, more Asian students. So at a typical HBCU, the number of white students, or put it differently, the proportion of white students has actually been declining. So that particular aspect of diversity is not something that one is seeing occurring at HBCUs over the last 10 years.
Several of the questions ask about specific programs or specific interventions. And again, in our data set, we cannot identify individual colleges. So if there are special programs that are taking place that doesn't enter into our analysis, we are looking at the general proposition for HBCUs. I think the key element, as Dr. Swinton said, is a matter of intention. And the study group that I was on for the National Academies to look at the importance of HBCUs and providing STEM graduates, that was the one thing that our study highlighted: intentionality. Is the school intent on, is its purpose to graduate Black students? And despite the diversity of the schools, intentionality is the same. So we're talking about schools with different histories, different resources, different locations, different student bodies. The one thing in common is a commitment to access, as evidenced by the very large share of low-income students who are present, a student body that looks like the Black population, and the intention to graduate them. That's the common denominator. I like to explain it to people that often, I can give you ingredients, That's not going to, I can give you the ingredients of the best chefs in America. That doesn't mean you can cook like they do. You have to have the intention. You have to have the intention to turn out that dish. And so I think sometimes we get wrapped up in individual things and forget, are you driven by purpose? Are you purpose driven? Are you really trying to achieve something? And what our data points to is that in and of itself is vitally important. And we shouldn't get lost in the forest for the trees.
Dr. Spriggs, I can add a little bit of comment on racial identification. IPEDS, of course, does report the self-identified racial characteristics of student bodies, but I emphasize self-identified because some people choose not to report. Also, there are many, of course, mixed race, mixed ethnic circumstances today, and the percentage of those has gone up dramatically. So it isn't quite as meaningful now to report, let's say, there are so many white people or so many black people in an institution when there are mixtures of people and then larger proportions of individuals who choose not to report.
Yes, well, diversity within the Black community is celebrated at many of our campuses. Students at Howard always describe it as one of the most diverse student bodies ever when they come, and people from outside don't understand that. But when you get to Howard, you understand there are students from the West Indies, there's students from Africa, there's students from Europe, there's students from South America, there's students from Alaska, there's students from Wyoming, and for the first time, many Black students are confronted with the fact that what they think of as Black culture is far more diverse than they ever imagined. And so, yeah, it the diversity within the student body, even with that self-identification, is important. Do we have any other comments among our presenters?
I think I saw a question about factors that contribute to low graduation rates at PWIs, and I don't think our research is saying anything about the low graduation rates at PWIs. What we're saying is that if a Black student at the mean would have attended an HBCU, they would have been more likely to graduate at a higher rate. I think one of the things that people don't understand about the higher education is, even though the percent of people who've been attending colleges has increased by a large amount, the percent of people who actually graduate with degrees hasn't increased by that greater amount. So there's this large population of students, people who have attended schools, who have some college but don't get a degree, right? And so the whole goal of a college is to convert those students. And all the research shows is that the Black student is more likely to get that degree if they attend an HBCU, all else equal. We're not saying that they wouldn't graduate from a PWI. We're just saying at the mean that student would have been more likely to graduate. And the number one predictor that's often used are sort of these pre-test performance like SAT and ACT. And you have to realize that Black students, the average SAT score is 800, where the average SAT score for white students is around 1,000, right? And so just based on that, a Black student is already at a lower predicted probability of graduating from college because their SAT or ACT performance is below that average as well. And so taking in the fact that lower income Black HBCUs are more likely to admit these students who other universities wouldn't take a chance on, and then they're successful at converting them to degrees, you have to actually do the welfare analysis that Dr. Spriggs talks about. But the benefit of attending the HBCU and having these schools that take on these students who might not graduate otherwise is something that adds a lot of value to what HBCUs produce and is oftentimes not talked about. There's a lot of open admissions HBCUs that allow students in to try for their 4-year degree that other institutions wouldn't even admit, right? And so even though they might not have high graduation rates. These students otherwise wouldn't have had a chance to get a college degree.
Let me add to that a bit with a specific example. I'm at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, about 25,000 students. 5 miles away from Old Dominion is Norfolk State University with about 5,000 or 6,000 students. And of course, Norfolk State is an HBCU. Now, Old Dominion's graduation rate for all of its students is higher, quite a bit higher than that at Norfolk State. And it's also higher for Black students. But, and here's the important but, once you control for SAT scores and family incomes, that advantage disappears. So what I'm saying is that when you control for important variables like income and SAT scores, that HBCUs then really are typically doing a better job than the PWIs. But that particular aspect of performance generally isn't given much attention. People simply look at the overall graduation rates. And even at Old Dominion versus Norfolk State, yes, the Black graduation rate at Old Dominion is higher than it is at Norfolk State. But you have to control for the underlying variables to see what the contribution of the HBCUs actually is.
Yes, and I think Dr. Cook has emphasized that, as well as this peculiar way in which we subsidize higher ed. A lot of discussion about free college. If you change the relative price against HBCUs, as we currently do, you're probably pulling some students away from a better outcome. And so we have to think about that. When you hear people say, let's make community college free, are you diverting students who probably should have been encouraged to attend an HBCU? This is why it's important that you listen to these debates carefully. African Americans earn associate degrees very commensurate with our share of the population. What we do not earn are bachelor's degrees. And there the gap has grown during this century. So programs that encourage Black associate degree attainment really aren't accomplishing anything more than what Black people have already figured out how to do themselves. And we should remember the economic outcome for Black students with associate degrees. Last month, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported the unemployment numbers, the unemployment rate for a Black person with an associate's degree was higher than for a white person who failed to finish high school. So a world in which we have a lot of Black people with associate degrees is not doing us a favor when the gap that is growing and is most significant is the ability of Black people to get bachelor's degrees. So we have to be sensitive to, are we putting money and taking efforts away from the attainment of four-year degrees, and are we diverting students by the way in which we subsidize some schools over others? And shouldn't we be figuring out how we level the playing field? I think all of that has to be taken into consideration. There's a question about students with associate degrees staying in their field. We don't have that information because we really weren't studying them. We just know that in general, there are these problems when you look in the aggregate.
One comment I would add in addition that Dr. Switten and I make in our book manuscript is that to many white people, especially those who grew up in the North, they may have been 1,000 miles away from the nearest HBCU, and they know little or nothing about HBCUs. Their HBCUs are sort of an exotic thing to them. They know just a little bit about their athletic teams, and especially if the HBCU beats a number 1 or number 2 rank in the NCAA tournament, that HBCU is very visible, but that tends to dissipate. So part of the challenge, if not a problem, in policy making in the United States today is massive numbers of individuals, mostly white, but they could be Hispanic and Asian, have little or no contact with HBCUs because they live so far away from them. And so they just do not have any knowledge slash sympathy for the circumstances of HBCUs.
I think that's correct. And as our data showed, 71% of the students in our sample attended school in state. And that speaks to the income of the typical Black family and sort of the cost of going to school out of state, transportation, and other challenges that come about that way. We're coming close to the end of our session. We have someone who is inviting students to know about using HBCU records to do genealogical research. I'm sympathetic to that because my hobby is genealogy. So if you're looking in the chat, there is a comment that invites you to an event where people can tie their family history to someone who attended an HBCU and how to go about doing that. And to Dr. Koch's point, there's a comment on how schools are able to help students on Pell with their individual funding out of college funds. And this is the big difference. But again, that model, as Dr. Koch was showing us, has its limit because for those schools to still function, they greatly reduce the number of students who are low income who attend. And so it's very nice that, as an example, many Ivy League schools will make up for the gap so that their low income students don't have to take out a loan. But if that means you only admit 4% of such students, that's not very deep into the share of low income students in the United States. And a nice comment about Cheney University, which is the oldest HBCUs, but very surprisingly not considered to be a jewel to the state of Pennsylvania, and constantly struggles with the state, a state that has dramatically cut funding to higher education, and Cheney State got no special treatment there to help it out. I'll give the panelists, we're going to close here, a quick moment. Nick, you want to say something? Or?
Yes. First, I want to thank the panelists here today, especially working with myself on this research. I think that this is not only a timely topic, but it's one that those who are present and listening to needs to go out and spread some of the results associated with it. I think that this strengthens the argument of why we need more funding associated towards HBCUs, and also create pathways by which high school students in particular can go to HBCUs, especially to gain their education. So I want to thank Omari, James, and Bill for working on this research, and I appreciate it.
Anything closing, Omari?
Thank you for your time today, and we appreciate you coming to listen to our research, and hopefully we'll have something that's out as a written document soon.
And Dr. Koch?
I would only add that this has been a great group to work with, and these are important issues, and I'm very pleased to be part of this conference.
I want to thank everyone. We're at 11:30, and so we appreciate all the time you took to stick through the panel. and for your comments. And please enjoy the rest of the HBCU week presentations and the ones that will follow later today.